Thank you. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about a couple different applications of 3D topographic differencing of meter scale topography. And the main point of this is to motivate the next hour, several hours, we'll be performing 3D topographic differencing both in MATLAB and Cloud Compare. So I'll be discussing some of my examples as well as some work from Ed Neeson, who did some of this work as a postdoc at ASU. He's now at University of Victoria. So what is 3D topographic differencing? Well, the idea is that we can calculate surface deformation using two different high-resolution topography data sets that span an earthquake. And this is a really neat technique because it allows us to resolve on-fault slip as well as off-fault deformation. Here's some examples. And this data set fills a near-fault data gap where other geodetic data sets such as INSAR and GPS commonly lack spatial resolution. And so today the focus is about what we can learn about the behavior of the shallow fault volume. So how does slip propagate from depth to the surface? So first we'll talk about some of Ed's work on the 2011 magnitude 6.6 Fukushima Hamadori earthquake. And this was a normal fault event that occurred 1 month after the Tohoku earthquake. The Tohoku earthquake is here, and then this 6.6 event is down here. And here is the INSAR differencing of that same event. And here's where we have Lidar coverage. And you can see that there's some loss of coherence in that box. In other words, you can't fully trace the INSAR fringes. So we're going to use Lidar to help fill in that gap, learn about the behavior of the shallow fault. Here's a picture of what the landscape looks like. It's highly vegetated. We can use Lidar to see under the trees and look at the fault scarp. So here's the before earthquake Lidar data. And then here's the after. If you're close, you can maybe see very subtle fault trace that cuts through the landscape here. So here's some field images and results. This left panel shows several different field photos. You can see this person measuring vertical offset along fault scarp here. And this plot here summarizes work by 3 different authors who measured field vertical offset in the field. And they show upwards of about 2 meters of on-fault vertical offset. We're now going to compare this to the Lidar results. So plot here shows the vertical differencing using the iterative closest point algorithm. And I'm not going to go into details about that right now, but by tomorrow at lunch, you'll know exactly how it works. But the point is here, we see that this eastern side of the fault has moved up by about 1 meter. This western side has moved down by about 2 meters. We can then look at fault perpendicular transects. So then shown here on the right. And we can identify the approximate fault location by looking at the sharp change in location or displacement across the fault strike. And we can learn a little bit more about the behavior of the shallow fault by looking at these along strike transects. So the red here shows the footwall displacement are shown here. The blue shows the hanging wall displacement here. And these are calculated about 300 meters from the fault trace. And so we think that they should represent slip at 300 meters depth. So we can then compare slip we infer to be at 300 meters depth from the vertical offset that we can measure in the field. We've shown a couple slides ago, and shows a maximum of 2 meters of slip, consistent with what we see from the topographic differencing. However, we note that some areas the surface slip is much lower and is also much more variable. So this suggests that only a small fraction of the slip at depth actually makes it fully to the surface, and that the slip at the surface is varies much more than slip at a few hundred meters depth. And we can, in fact, put stronger constraints on where the slip depletion happens. So when we do ICP, in addition to inferring displacement, we also can learn about rotation. So this plot here shows y-axis rotation. So it's essentially looking at rotation with the rotation axis aligned with the strike of the fault. And these blue highlight the fault trace and show that the location is localized to 1 or 2 50-meter pixels located to the fault. Therefore, we infer that the slip depletion must have happened in the upper 50 or so meters of the fault. Yes. So here's the scale showing rotation. So we see blue down here shows rotation, white shows 0. So then you look here on the fault, and these blue dots nicely highlight the linear fault trace, and they show that the rotation that's non-zero basically occurs within a very localized window. So we only have rotation so it's y-axis, so it's basically north axis rotation. And so it shows that rotation in this sense is basically very localized to the fault. So from that, we say that further from the fault, we have more coherent motion, but then at this very localized region along the fault where we had this rotation, so changes in displacement adjacent to the fault, but not exactly at the fault. So therefore, tens of meters surrounding the fault, and then at tens of meters depth where the slip was lost. Does that make sense? So now we're going to switch earthquakes. We're going to move down the Japanese coast. I'm going to talk about some of my work on the 2016 magnitude 7 Kumamoto earthquake. This is a right lateral earthquake that ruptured faults on the Kyushu Island here in southwestern Japan. And there's a really interesting story about the data collection for this earthquake. In fact, the pre-earthquake data was acquired 12 hours before the main shock. 12 hours. And the reason is there were several foreshocks that motivated the Japanese government to really quickly mobilize to acquire what ended up being the pre-earthquake data, but was in fact meant to be used to image several magnitude 6 event earthquakes. And the post-earthquake data was acquired about a week later. And so this earthquake record is really amazing in how well it brackets the earthquake. So yes, here we show that the earthquake propagated along the Hinegu fault and then propagated to the Surigawa fault. It actually continued about 20 kilometers to the east beyond the extent of the Lidar coverage, and believed that the Aso caldera about here stopped the propagating rupture. So today we're going to look at several different ways of measuring surface displacement. First, we're going to talk about how we can measure the surface offset looking at field measurements. Then we can look at the behavior of the fault at tens of meters depth, something I'll call the Lidar displacement discontinuity. Finally, we can invert for slip from the depth or from the surface to the depth of the seismogenic zone using a Lidar optical INSAR earthquake source inversion. We'll talk about each of these individually. So here's the results from the ICP differencing, the data set that I just showed. We can infer 3D displacement. So here we see displacement in the plus X direction, or east-northeast displacement. And this shows about 2.5 meters of slip that's quite localized to the fault trace. Here we have the plus Y, or north-northwest displacement. And this bottom plot shows the vertical displacement, where we see about 2 meters of slip, but it's actually quite distributed. It's not localized to the fault trace in quite the same way that we see the horizontal slip up here. We now look at the field measurements that were made by a team led by Hirohama, team of about 20 scientists made in the first 2 weeks after the earthquake. And they measured about 200 surface offsets, which are summarized here. So this shows a simplified fault trace. And here I plotted strike slip displacement, plotted in the same colors as the faults above. And they see about maximum of just over 2 meters of slip, as well as less lateral slip on this conjugate fault right here. So then I developed a calculation that I call the Lidar displacement discontinuity. The idea of this is twofold. First is to develop a comparison for comparing the Lidar data to the field measurements. And second, it's going to end up being a metric for slip at tens of meters of depth. Calculation is shown here. We calculate the ICP displacements in windows, back in 2 windows that lie on opposite sides of the fault. Then to calculate right lateral displacement, I take the difference in displacement across the fault and project that along the fault trace. The results for this red fault are shown here. There is some scatter, so we see about 2 meters of slip for this red fault. Now I'm going to show what the analysis for all the faults look like. So it looks quite complicated, but then the summary here is black, which is the sum slip. And I would emphasize that while we have a fairly complex fault geometry, the sum slip is a much simpler envelope. And that signifies that while we have this complex surface geometry, there's a much simpler release of energy at depth. And here we're going to compare field measurements to Lidar displacement discontinuity, following a similar approach to Ed's work. And so here on the X or the Y-axis shows the Lidar displacement discontinuity. And here is the field offset. So imagine the guy in the field. For all of these faults plotted in the same color as the fault. So here's the one-to-one line. What we see is that the displacement discontinuity commonly exceeds the field measurements. So this, to me, signifies that we have a depletion of slip from the upper tens of meters of the crust to the surface. It's very similar to what Ed had shown with the rotation axis that we were just talking about. So I was also interested in understanding what regions surrounding the crust deformed inelastically. So I explored this question. I calculated the first invariant of the 2D strain tensor, which is essentially area change. and that's shown here. So the red are the fault traces, and then the color shows the area change calculated from the strain tensor. So we see here this red is extension and the blue is contraction. To then look at areas that deformed inelastically, calculated the inelastic strain limit by taking the ratio of the yield stress to Young's modulus. For a range of hard rocks, this actually ends up being about 0.5%, which is interesting. And then these black outlines contour regions that are likely to have deformed inelastically. So we see, particularly in this area, several hundred meters width of inelastic deformation surrounding the fault trace. And it's likely that off-fault secondary fracturing and folding accommodated some of the secondary deformation. Here, this shows the shear strain. We note that it is much more localized onto the fault trace than the area change. Then I want to explore how the displacement changes with the width of the inelastic zone. So here, the y-axis is this displacement discontinuity, and the x-axis is the width of the inelastic zone. First, just pay attention to the green point. We see that to accumulate any inelastic deformation, we need about 0.5 meter of slip. And then for some time, the width of the inelastic zone grows with the amount of displacement. Now, we reach a particular threshold here of about 2 to 3 meters of slip, at which the inelastic zone continues to grow or widen without localizing any more slip to the fault trace. That was the first half of the project. We're now going to talk about Lidar optical INSAR earthquake source inversion. This time the work is going to focus on the entire fault trace. So there's 3 data sets here. First is the Lidar, and to the best of my knowledge, this is the first earthquake source inversion to actually use Lidar data. The Lidar data has this footprint here, which is then shown in the smaller figure here. I also use optical data, which is shown here, and they'll use east-west optical displacements. Then the 2 INSAR data sets have much larger footprints. They constrain near vertical deformation. One of the biggest challenges of developing this slip model was figuring out how to make a fault geometry that was both consistent with the geometry that we see in the Lidar data, but was simple enough for the inversion to remain computationally feasible. And so what I did was kink the fault traces to follow a simplified version of surface traces mapped by the Japanese Geological Survey. Japanese geological surveys are shown in, faults are shown here in cyan, and then the faults that are used in the slip model are these thicker lines here in red, green, and blue. So here is just a picture of that fault trace. With surface trace here, it kinks to follow the surface geology, surface fault, and then these kinks are damped at depth, so the fault at depth is smoother than the fault at the surface. Here's the resulting slip distribution, which achieves a magnitude 6.97, maximum slip of 5.6 meters, located here at the intersection between the Furugawa and the Hinagu fault. We see a small depletion of slip in the shallow crust, which I'll discuss more on the next slide. So here we can see how well this model does in replicating the data. First column shows the surface displacement, so the input data set. Second column shows the surface displacements predicted by the slip model. And this final column is the residual, so the difference between the data and the slip model predicted displacement. This shows for the Lidar, the optical, and then the two INSAR data sets. And I would say that the slip model does a decent job of predicting or reproducing the surface displacements. However, the largest residuals, the largest errors in the slip model occur adjacent to the fault. For example, if we look in the Lidar data, here we see large residuals that trace out the fault trace. And there's a couple reasons for these. First is that these residuals probably reflect an overly simplified fault geometry. So the Lidar require a much more complex geometry than INSAR or GPS commonly do, but still perhaps the model would be better with additional complexity. Second, as I showed earlier, there was off-fault inelastic deformation, and this model does not allow for any deformation off the principal fault traces, and it assumes that the crust deforms inelastically. So, but that's for second project. So building this slip model requires integrating data sets with different spatial distributions and different sensitivity to the 3D deformation field. The really important question then becomes, how do each of the data sets constrain the fault slip? The answer is right here. So this is looking for strike slip and dip slip, and each of the fault patches are colored by the data that has the dominant impact on the slip. And so for here, these blue patches are constrained most by the horizontal Lidar data. The Lidar blue are constrained by the vertical Lidar data, the yellow by the optical, and the red by the INSAR. So we see is that in the area of Lidar coverage, Lidar data exerts the dominant influence. This makes sense. Here along strike, where there is no Lidar data, the optical constrain the shallow strike slip motion, and INSAR constrains deeper and most of the dip slip motion outside of the Lidar coverage. And because we have two INSAR flights with different look directions, they do contribute significantly to our sensitivity to horizontal deformation. We can summarize this information here in this depth versus resolving power of the three data sets. We see that Lidar exerts strongest influence at the surface, with decreasing influence at depth. In contrast, the opposite pattern with INSAR, we have lowest influence at the surface and larger influence at depth. With this crossover point here between the Lidar and INSAR at about 5 kilometers depth. So in conclusion, here I've looked at variations in fault slip from a joint Lidar optical INSAR earthquake source inversion. And the high near fault strain suggests that the depleted slip is accommodated along secondary structures. Finally, the inelastic failure of the damaged fault zone rocks caused by the high strains produces a distributed inelastic deformation signal. And so what can you do? Well, we're going to spend the rest of the afternoon talking about that. But here's two large opportunities for ICP differencing. So first is Lidar to Lidar. And for this, we require pre-earthquake data, which is already acquired along many active faults. For example, the B4 and EarthCube data on the San Andreas. But as we learned here for the Kumamoto, if you can get data following pre-shock activity, then you might not even need decades long of acquisition prior to the earthquake. And While we're designing these surveys, it's good to keep in mind that the faster we acquire the post-earthquake imagery, we can then better distinguish between the and post-seismic deformation. Another opportunity is hybrid Lidar photogrammetry differencing. And I'm involved in a couple of these projects. And big benefit of this type of differencing is that smaller research groups can go and buy a drone and image a particular area. They don't need a Lidar aircraft. They can then go and re-image at a later date. There are two large challenges. First is that you need to have good location accuracy. So it's important to have good differential GPS survey of the photogrammetry area. And then there's going to be technical issues in differencing two different data types. So, thank you.
Right, that is, I was wondering, for those of us who might study prophecy as displacements or something, do you have any minimize track mark offset?
I worked on various approaches to try to mitigate some of these offsets, and there are commercial codes. You generally actually need quite a bit of metadata about the IMU to get these, to use these commercial codes to get rid of some of these track line offsets. So if you have the metadata and the money, you can do more than here.